this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. Very sunny and spring-like. And, of course, the situation here has taken a turn for the better towards optimism and out of this nightmare of the past 118 days. Now, in effect, we have gone through a great historical watershed. It is a turning point in the history of the United States, and I think of the Trump administration, and something with a certain amount of positive promise for the world, although the pitfalls are very obvious, and we'll detail those without fear or favor later here in the show. But it's a great watershed. The terrible thing about the 118 days leading up to Wednesday and the appointment finally of a special prosecutor on Russiagate and the various activities of possible perjury, obstruction of justice, and similar shenanigans connected to that, was that it looked like the entire constitutional system had broken down and was out of action, KO. That, of course, the Republican Party is dead. The Republican Party is morally dead, intellectually dead, and politically dead, too. I hope before too long. I think they're very definitely on track for it. The ones that are not dead are morally insane. And these are nihilists. This is a party of nihilism now. Their previous ideologies, right, be it Chamber of Commerce, pro-business ideology, out the window, Buckleyite, free market, free trade, out the window, whether it's Milton Friedman, out the window, von Hayek, the libertarians, out the window, and of course, even the Russian fascist Ayn Rand, they're not really living up to her either. What they're interested in, of course, is money. Power, of course, but power with them primarily as a means to money. These are the legions of greed in the Republican Party. And the scandal was that this morally insane or morally dead, take your pick, case by case, party, was not going to apply any of the relevant checks and balances to prevent an erratic and unbalanced, unstable individual from running amok on the national and world stages. And it includes some pretty shocking prima facie cases for obstruction of justice, perjury in the case of the Attorney General candidate, and so forth. So it looked like a situation where the government of law had gone out the window. The checks and balances were inoperative. It was a government of people, and of pretty sick people at that, and it didn't look like there was any mechanism to put the brakes on. Now, the very least we can say after this past week is that that is no longer the case. This moment of what looked like an unchecked dictatorship, a despotism, right? One-man rule with no institutional checks and balances, or at least the threat of that. That's out the window. Now, of course, there were checks and balances, right? Even if the same brain-dead, morally insane Republican Party controls the White House, the Senate, the House, and the Supreme Court, there are still other mechanisms, right? There's a permanent civil service bureaucracy. Thank God for them. In other words, people in Washington who have been in government before the current regime and will be here after the current regime, and they don't forget this. So you can say they're unelected, but let's not go too far down that road, because then we see how flawed the election system is, right? With gerrymandering and the over valuation of very rural and sparsely populated states and all the rest of it. Let's just avoid that. This is not the heart of the argument. The system is what it is, but there's also a permanent civil service bureaucracy, and it includes the intelligence agencies. Anybody who goes out of his way, once you're on your way to power, to pick quarrels with these intelligence agencies over public relations issues is simply acting with folly, with reckless folly, utter folly. If you say that they're against you and you're against them, then you're going to act that out. So that's one thing. We have the third branch, and the third branch can be manipulated and perverted at the top, as it has been. But there are these other levels, right? There are still some federal district judges out there. There are some federal appellate judges, and they can have their say. And they have done it. And therefore, these outrageous Muslim bans masquerading as immigration and travel bans, they are still frozen. They have been stopped in their tracks. And the debate, the Q&A at the last hearing in the Ninth Circuit in Seattle didn't go too well for the U.S. acting Solicitor General. And of course, they were interested in reading the executive order, the second one, in the context of the raving campaign statements that preceded the election, as they must. They don't have to be blind. The world is not created anew every morning, right? We don't have to all pretend we were born yesterday. And then, of course, the states. Yes, the states. How wonderful to see states like Washington State, Oregon, Hawaii, Maryland here has done yeoman's service, right? Attorney General Brian Frosh of Annapolis, Maryland, our government in Annapolis here in Maryland, right? And they have taken the lead. And as a matter of fact, we had a Maryland judge this week. I'm sorry, it's a Michigan judge, demanding to see the memorandum from Giuliani to Trump where he was requested, show me how to do a Muslim ban and make it look legal. And there's a memo. And that judge in Michigan, that federal district judge says, I want to see that memo because you're saying this is not what it is. I think it may be. Let's see that memo. So there are these countervailing forces. The bureaucracy, the federal judges, the states, many states fight back, and they do. And, of course, the media, but perhaps most of all, the public, the mass strike, 5.3 million people in the streets on January 21st. Vastly eclipsing this sparse and meager inauguration and causing a prolonged temper tantrum for just that reason. We've had the Women's March. We've had the march about immigrants. We've had the Tax Day March with 125,000 people. We've had two environmentalist marches, about 100,000 each minimum across the U.S. We've had interventions that have been heroic in these town hall meetings. I would call everybody's attention especially to the tape you can find of it's about a 4-hour plus Q&A back and forth at the town meeting held by the infamous Republican Congressman Tom MacArthur near Toms River, New Jersey, Jersey Shore, about halfway down the coast of New Jersey. And in particular, one very eloquent person who looks to me like a real person. I don't think he's a pro sent in by the Democratic National Committee who simply makes these points. And we'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. We're just pausing to take stock now. It's about 120 days into the regime, and we've just gone through a very important turning point. Actually, far more important than the end of the 100 days was day 118 and the naming, finally, of a special prosecutor. Don't quibble about the terminology. call it a special prosecutor, a counsel. What is a counsel? The average person doesn't know what that means. A special prosecutor is the only acceptable name. Don't let these sophists and representatives of Gorgias and the enemy of Plato, don't let them take over the terminology, right? They held back the cause of Medicare for all for many years by insisting on calling it single payer, and nobody knew what the hell that was. So forget single payer, go for Medicare for all. And what we've got now is a special prosecutor. And that's also to remind him that his job is to prosecute. He's not just a special investigator. He's not just to be there as a lawyer, as a counsel, as an attorney. No, he's there to prosecute. And that's what we're looking forward to. And we mean to see it. I wanted to just remind you once again, we can go through the various countervailing forces that are necessary for the maintenance of liberty and freedom. Those would include the permanent civil service bureaucracy, you bet. The federal judiciary, much maligned, but we need it. The states, especially progressive states, they've done wonders with the resources they have, and they'll do more. And then, of course, the media. This is a new renaissance of print media. Essentially, every night you can expect somebody to come forward with a story which is going to be highly interesting. We'll go through a couple in just a minute. But this means the Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN, NBC, CBS, Associated Press, Reuters, the Daily Beast, Yahoo News, McClatchy, big and small, all of them getting into the act, right? You're going to be a poor press organ if you don't get some kind of a revelation, some kind of a leak. And I guess the other check and balance, of course, are the leakers. Yes, we know that this is technically a crime, but if we didn't have those people willing to stick their necks out, I would regard it as a kind of civil disobedience in some ways. Because otherwise we might have Michael Flynn still in the White House if it were left up to the depraved criteria that are in use there. And that would be a fine fix, wouldn't it? There's a wonderful quote from Abraham Lincoln where he says, "The Constitution is not a suicide pact, and it would be folly to allow some minor technical issues to destroy the entire government and to destroy all the freedoms." So sometimes you have to cut corners a little bit. The Constitution is not a suicide pact, and it's probably better to have some leaks than to have a foreign agent in control of large parts of the U.S. government, or better yet, seated at a nexus where these various factors come together. So those are the countervailing forces, but as I say, once again, it's the people. It's the American people, the land of the mass movements. New Deal America is living up to its name, the strongest civil society in the world, the citizenry that in many ways seems to be most awake, at least by now. It took a while. You can say the French woke up faster, but again, they had the benefit of this terrible spectacle going on in Washington and indeed in London. But now we've got it, right? There's the wonderful quote from Yamamoto that he felt that he was going to awaken a sleeping giant and fill that giant with a terrible resolve. Somehow that is happening right now here in our time. To be fully awake, though, you've got to have a comprehensive program. You've got to be campaigning for things like free college for everybody, Medicare for all, a $15 minimum wage, and a total of 40 million new productive jobs. 10 million of those destined for disadvantaged rural, Appalachian, inner city, ghetto youth. And that's about 10 million. That can be paid for with federal tax money, treasury money, through the Wall Street sales tax. The larger chunk, though, the $30 million, that's going to be financed by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is going to cough up $5 trillion of 0% 100-year credit, if needed, to get infrastructure going, to fulfill the checklist of the American Society of Civil Engineers. It gets you very close to $5 trillion. That way you get full employment for the first time since 1945. And, of course, you solve your infrastructure question. So a total of 10 plus 30 equals 40 million new productive jobs. The public debate is moving that way. That's what it means to be awake. But anyway, we've had 5.3 million people in the streets on January 21st. We've had heroic interventions into the town hall meetings. We've had a series of demonstrations on a rolling basis. Now the summer is reaching most of the country. We can expect to have more. There is, let me say right off the bat, the March for Truth on June 3rd. Some of the demands that were raised there are slightly obsolete. We already have now a special prosecutor. What we need now are prosecutions. And, of course, an independent commission. That's a good idea, too. A Kane-Hamilton commission, but without the flaws. That means a commission that is dedicated to airing the public record and showing what happened and making policy recommendations, right? What should be changed. And again, if you want to get a sample of how awake and alert many parts of the U.S. population are, take a look at that wonderful tape. It's a long tape. It's worth it to listen to. Congressman Tom MacArthur. This is not just anybody. This is the magus, right? The imp who brought Trump Care and Ryan Care back from the dead with his infamous amendment saying, well, we want to have various rights for the American people, but we'll let the state governors waive them, right? The state governors can decide. Some reactionary, benighted, godforsaken state can simply say, well, we're not going to have those guarantees. Watch those tapes. And one guy in particular, you'll know it when you see it, engages him. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So do remember now, June 3rd, there's the March for Truth. And that should be a march, I think that's something people should attend. Remember, notice this march does not correspond to any identity politics group, right? It's not women. It's not civil rights. It's not Latinos. It's not environmentalists. We want to have an honest government. We don't like dictatorship and authoritarianism. We don't like psychosis being acted out at the highest level of government. So, that's going to be on June 3rd. And I urge people to go out to that, and bring your own sign, right? Bring your own sign, showing what you think should happen. You can gather what I think should happen. But, if you believe in the 25th Amendment or if you believe in impeachment, then that's the time to make that known. The elected representatives, are doing better than they have, but they've got 30 to 40 years of bad habits that they've got to get rid of. At the same time, though, even on June 3rd, I want to alert people the Left Forum will be held in New York City. The Left Forum takes place this year on the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th of June in New York City. It's going to be held at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice over on the West Side. So I want people to think about, to consider going to that. We will be there. The Tax Wall Street Party, the United Front Against Austerity, yours truly, all on the scene. And we'll be considering, first of all, the institutional issues, the question of the rebuilding or the autopsy of the old party system. Republicans and Wall Street Democrats, that's no good. It's going to have to lead to the extinction of the Republicans and the split of the Democrats into pro-Wall Street and anti-Wall Street factions. You want to get ready for that. So that's one issue. We also want to treat this question of Russian interference, what it means, why this is, historical precedents, ways to understand it. And then a second panel is going to be about ideology, right? The crisis of what's called conservatism, but also then the threat posed by nihilism and the cynical nihilism in particular of these reactionary circles. Why cultural populism is poison. Economic populism works fine. Cultural populism is poison. And that's the big difference. And I think that's also the big lesson of the French elections. What you saw with Mélenchon versus Le Pen in particular, and sort of a sub-engagement in the first round of the French elections. It shows that if you have a hard-hitting, fighting economic populism, and we can do much better than Mélenchon in that department, but he's also a good campaigner and what have you, that can defeat the empty, hollow demagogy of racism, xenophobia, and the rest. And that's what we're going to need. At the same time, though, you've got to have that program. You've got to be able to credibly promise an actual industrial renaissance, full employment, rising standard of living, increased longevity. That's going to be a tremendous issue. The life expectancy in many parts of the U.S. is now falling. The diseases of despair are kicking in. You can't just go in there with anti-Trump. It won't work. Things are much too far gone for that. You've got to have positive solutions to the main economic problems, existential, everyday, life or death issues of the American people. You've got to answer those. Only that way can you break off and detach large parts of the Republican bloc and consign them to the dustbin of history where they belong. So, I know some people are thinking, oh, look at that special prosecutor, our wonderful hero, the outsider. The president is an outsider, and he's our wonderful populist hero. And those mean and wicked insiders have gotten themselves together now, and they're counterattacking, and they want to get rid of him. I mean, don't you think it's time to stop reading fairy tales? Don't you think it's time to grow up? Don't you think it's time to turn away from the status of dupe and gull and mark and useful idiot? There's another one. Look, this is a administration that has turned the government over to Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs rules the roost. Are they up to 6, 7, 8 top-level appointees? Secretary of the Treasury, head of the White House Economic Council, NSC advisor, on and on. Goldman Sachs. That's a wonderful group of outsiders, led by somebody who had a sweetheart relation with the New York branch of the Federal Reserve, that great group of outsiders. And that wonderful anti-establishment people, the television networks, where there was also a special relationship. This is an administration, dear friends. On the first day, the first thing they did was to increase your interest on mortgages. If you had an FHA, Federal Housing Administration mortgage, your interest was raised on the first day. In the first 6 hours, they jacked it up for you. In the past week, we've had student loans. The interest on student loans has been increased, right? We're approaching 1.5 trillion of crushing student loan debt, tremendous burden, which is, it's interfering with the lives now of millions and millions of young people. And what is the wonderful outsider administration? They're so dedicated to working people and blue-collar white workers. Yeah. Well, they increased your student loan rate. And then, of course, Trump care, right? 24 million losers concentrated in the states that were foolish enough to vote for the Republican ticket. That's a wonderful group of outsiders. Man, those anti-establishment fighters, they really inspire us. So I've always said for people like this, look, if you really believe this now after everything that we've seen, maybe it's time for some nice hobbies. I mean, stamp collecting and coin collecting, that's fine. Golf is another one. You can do all sorts of things. Knitting, quilts, take up painting, right? Like Winston Churchill in retirement or George Bush the Younger in retirement. There are all sorts of things you can do. But if you still believe in this fable about insiders and outsiders and anti-establishment and the elite, you got to have your head examined. You ought to get out of politics. You should just leave it alone. It's not your cup of tea. And if you believe that this crew that's now in power is bringing you prosperity, man, you better get your head examined. Look what they've done. Again, your mortgage went up, your student loan rate went up, and you're going to lose your medical care. And remember, some of those changes, right, the abolition of the 12 essential medical benefits, that reaches into your policy even if you're one of the 125 million who get it through a job. That's going to strip you of your rights. Don't think this is only happening to poor people. It's happening to just about everybody. So, by their fruits shall ye know them. And in this case, not so good. Now, of course, I have to hurry to plug my daily radio program Monday through Thursday. It's called The American System. And you should come on and go to americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv, and subscribe. It costs you $7.99, I think $8, the price of a couple of frappuccino, and you can hear this 4 additional days a week. I'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So, support my work. It's worth supporting. We've been abreast of this news. We've actually been ahead of this news, huh? A lot of the stuff you would have heard here a year ago is now on the front pages and in the headlines about mental state and any number of other things. But in order to do that, americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv, subscribe. We need you. We need your help and we need your influence. And if you follow this, you're going to know what to do. Now, what is that movie with Burt Lancaster is the bad guy who wants to have a coup, and Kirk Douglas is the good guy officer who wants to stop him, and Ava Gardner is this interesting woman who's acquainted with both of them. Frederick March, at the end of his career, is the president, not very popular. 7 days in May, I forget. The poll on the Preakness. Hey, the Preakness is the 20th of May. It's tomorrow from the point of view of recording here on Friday the 19th, right? The poll on the Preakness, which is really a coup. Well, watch out for coups. So 10 days in May, on May 8th, Obama was revealed to have warned Trump, don't hire Flynn for the NSC. You'll regret it. And right he was. And don't say that he'd gotten a security clearance 2 years before. He'd also fired him in the meantime. What a lame excuse. What a buck passer. On the 9th of May, Comey fired. It's the Tuesday afternoon massacre. So reminiscent of Nixon's Saturday night massacre. We went through the parallels, but we're in Watergate country. That's what we learned on Tuesday, May 9th, as I recall. On the 10th, the two Soviet Russian representatives, Lavrov and Kislyak, come to the White House, and the TASS photographer is there, but no Americans are there. I mean, it is a little bit strange. And, of course, we'll find out later what went on in that meeting. On the 11th, the tenant of the Oval Office decided to unceremoniously dump his helpers under the bus, the proverbial bus. when he came out to say, look, I didn't rely on any Rosenstein memo. I'm a tough guy. That was my decision. I am absolute and autocratic. I made this decision a priori compared to Rosenstein, right? Not a posteriori. I didn't have to read Rosenstein. I knew what I wanted. And in fact, it looks like Rosenstein was told, you write a memo because we're going to fire this guy, Comey. On the 12th of May, the infamous tweet, Dear Comey, you better hope we don't have any tapes before you start leaking to the press. Oh my God, Alexander Butterfield rolls over in his grave. This is the assistant to Haldeman who revealed in the summer of 1973 under questioning from the Sam Ervin committee, yes, there's a White House taping system. And of course, as we go back, right, many of those with knowledge of the Manhattan real estate and related scenes going back decades say that this was part of the modus operandi, the MO of the current chief executive. On Saturday the 13th, we had a little bit of surcease. That was when the FBI talent search began. On the 14th, we had golf. On the 15th, we had Blurtgate. Blurtgate was that in that meeting with the Russian representatives on May 10th, that our hero blurted out some important state secrets about how the U.S. knows, what the U.S. knows about this question of apparently the exploding laptops and the new techniques and new nefarious things being done by Al-Qaeda. Originally, the idea was it might have been King Abdullah of Jordan, who was the injured party, since this was borrowed intelligence. It was not the U.S. Had generated this, but a third country, or a different country. But instead, after that, it swung over towards the Israelis. Now, I'm still not sure I believe that. It's not clear to me, because for the Israelis, it's not a problem, but it becomes a tool. Whereas for King Abdullah, it might be a real embarrassment and it might destabilize him. Anyway, that was Blurtgate on the 15th of May. Then on the 16th of May, we have this infamous memo, this aide-memoire by Comey, read to a reporter of the New York Times by some friend in his entourage. The famous dinner on February 14th, where he's talking, this is now Don Trump, talking to Comey, I hope you can let it go. In effect, I hope you can lay off Comey with this, Comey, please lay off Flynn with this investigation. So don't probe Flynn too vigorously, let it go. Finally, that seems to have been the thing that pushed the, what can we say, the somewhat changeable and erratic Rosenstein over the limit, so that it was on the 17th, Wednesday of this past week, that Bob Mueller III, Robert S. Mueller III, former FBI director, was appointed as what I'm going to call special prosecutor, just to make it absolutely crystal clear what it is and what it's supposed to do in my book. Forget the technicalities. And of course, on these days, right, the 16th and the 17th and into the 18th, we had the whining at the Coast Guard address, right? Hitch your wagon to a star, but look what's happened to me. I've been treated worse than any president in recent history. You want to be the man on horseback? You want to be a tough guy? You want to make everybody tremble? You can't go out there and say, "Wah, look how mean they are to me." That just doesn't work, right? You've got to make blood-curdling threats. That's a different story. But just to get out there and say, look what these people are doing. And of course, yesterday, the 18th of May, a press conference with President Santos of Colombia, where the complaint was that it's a witch hunt. And of course, the tenet of the Oval Office is the victimhood. Victimhood, the quest for victimhood is something that many right-wingers ridicule, and I think they do have a point, right? The idea that the more you're a victim, the better you are, or the more you deserve. I don't know if that's always true, but that seems to be the obligatory doctrine of the state. So remember then, that's one chronology. The other chronology to keep in mind is what happened. That Flynn was interviewed by the FBI in the White House on the 24th of January. On the 26th of January, a Thursday, Sally Yates called McGahn, the White House lawyer, and said, I'm coming over to tell you urgent news. Face to face, it has to be. The news was, Flynn is compromised. He could be blackmailed. I'm telling you this so you can act, but you got to do something about it. Called back the next day on the 27th. Hey, and on the evening of the 27th, the Trump-Comey dinner, where the request seems to have been made to back off. We've also got a February 14th contact between the two. We'll repeat this in the next segment because it's important to get this all right? So it's a story that goes back to the very first days of the new administration. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley here in sunny Washington, D.C. So here's the Flynn, Trump, Comey chronology. January 24th, Flynn interviewed by the FBI at the White House. It doesn't go well. On the 25th, Sally Yates, acting Attorney General, examines the results. She determines on January 26th that she's got to call McGahn at the White House, the in-house lawyer. I've got to see you right away. It's urgent. You must act. She goes there on the 26th of January. McGahn calls her back on the 27th of January, and that same evening, January 27th, Friday, a hurriedly arranged dinner of Comey with Trump at the White House occurs. Now, we're getting all kinds of stories this week that Comey was very uneasy, very ill at ease in these meetings. He felt that he was being pressed to make concessions. And in particular, in the first one, we had repeated demands for a loyalty oath. Well, you don't have loyalty oaths to individuals in this country. You had one in the German armed forces in the 1930s into the 40s. There was a personal oath to an individual, but that's not the system here. Let's make sure it doesn't become one of that type. So that was January 27th. That dinner must have been set up either on the 26th or the 27th. In other words, after getting the word from Yates that Flynn was compromised and was blackmailable. However, there was no hurry. 18 days more of Flynn. Then Flynn is fired on the 13th of February. On the 14th, St. Valentine's Day, we have another contact between Trump and Flynn. This time the word is, I hope you can let this thing go. Lay off Flynn. Sessions was in the room. He was told to leave. This was private, and there you go. So that was that's a memo that was given to the New York Times. On March 20th, finally, this the feckless Nunes was unable to prevent Comey and others from testifying at the House Intelligence Committee public session. And here, Comey revealed that there was a counterintelligence investigation, including criminal, started in July of 2016, and that was still ongoing. Then, on May 9th, we had the firing, the Tuesday afternoon massacre. Comey fired. And in that letter, of course, we have this claim thank you for exonerating me 3 times privately. Now, from the very beginning of these contacts, it would appear that the tenant of the White House was demanding a public statement, a public exoneration, a public statement from the FBI saying, we are not investigating Trump. He is not a target, nothing of the sort. So there you have it. And this will be the starting point. Now, it's all very well to have a special prosecutor, but this does not replace the political process. On the one side, Ryan and company, that gaggle of nihilists on the Hill, they seem to think, well, now we can retreat behind the cover of Mueller as the independent, as the special prosecutor, and we can go back to our genocidal agenda. We can go back to destroying Obamacare, undermining Medicare, undermining Medicaid, preparing the demise of Social Security. In other words, the full arch-reactionary program, the Ayn Rand program, which essentially says if you don't have money for health care, then you don't deserve it. You probably ought to die. That's the Republican view. And again, if you can't see that, stay out of politics. Don't have a voice because you're too dumb. You're essentially brain dead if you can't see that part. 24 million thrown off the rolls, right? And the wonderful free market. Die for the free market with the Republican Party. So we have to make sure that doesn't happen. Now, by all indications, the Trump agenda ought to be dead in the water right now. In other words, this whole impetus, right, the ability of this administration to shepherd legislation through. This should be over, done, finish. But we don't know, and therefore vigilance and above all mobilization. Go to those town hall meetings. Right? What we've seen is the most eloquent proof that individual activism multiplied by hundreds of thousands and millions, of course, does make a big difference. It makes a great deal of difference, right? The nervousness of the Republicans is a monument to that. By the way, it turns out that the nihilist clique around Ryan is also inept just in terms of the technicalities, right? In terms of the nuts and bolts. Incompetent. That is to say, they've been holding on to that odious bill, right? The bill that occasioned the rally at the White House, the odious Trump Care bill, with the MacArthur amendment in it. They've been sitting on that because they're waiting for the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, scoring. That's going to be interesting. That may come next week. The Congressional Budget Office is going to say how many will lose their coverage, how much it will cost, how much it will, the damage, essentially, the damage report or the damage assessment, right, pre-target. Now, the reason they have to do this is because they want to pass it through the Senate using the budget reconciliation rules, which limits the amount of, or the type of changes that can be made in such a bill, and therefore they're holding on to see, right? Because if it adds too much to the deficit or things of this sort, then it's going to be a problem. So they're holding on to it. And they may have to have a second vote. If the Congressional Budget Office tells the truth about what a disastrous bill this is, it may be that Ryan will have to go back to the entire House and get them to vote again. And that's why in this interval now, between whenever this, up to whenever this occurs, people get engaged, go out there, be like those highly motivated, very intelligent, surprisingly well-informed people near Toms River, New Jersey. It's not exactly South Jersey. It's sort of the middle. It's more or less at the level of Philadelphia from my quick glance at the map. But these are not Wall Street or Washington insiders. Right? These are real people, as far as I can see. So get out there and fight for your own interests. So that ought to be one of them. Wall Street, by the way, has voted no confidence. We had this big dive, right? A 2% dive of the main New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, S&P 500 those indices took a 2% dive at the middle of the week because the idea was, hey, we may not get our tax cut. And, of course, this is the whole thing. The legions of greed support Trump because they think he's the bringer of this tax bonanza windfall, the cutting of the corporate tax, right? The federal corporate income tax, what they call business tax. It means the tax on banks. It's what the zombie bankers pay. That's going to be cut from 35 to 15. Yikes. And of course that gets into trillions, whereas that same method, let's give you a little tax cut, right? It's going to be some penny ante paltry, peanuts kind of, tax cut for the average person, if at all, right? If it's not even an increase. So, all that, happening. So, it's important for this agenda to stop it. He has no moral authority, never had any moral authority, and his political effectiveness is now used up. So forget it. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C. Now, the Ryan clique, the nihilism, right? If you have any doubts about this, get the transcript of that conversation because they're all there, right? Ryan is there. Kevin McCarthy, the Republican majority leader, is there. Steve Scalise, the Republican chief whip. Kathy McMorris Rogers, the head of the Republican conference. In other words, the Republican House leadership. And in a moment of candor, perhaps moved by the Holy Spirit, I don't know, this McCarthy comes out and says there are two people that are paid for by Moscow, right? The Kremlin pays Congressman Rohrabacher of California and Trump. And immediately Ryan says, look, our meeting here is off the record. No leaks. We have to be a family here. And this is how we can show that we're a family. So cynical nihilism. What do they believe in? They believe in nothing. They believe that they want to get their tax bonanza through, and they want to wreck the regulations, right? They want to do the deconstruction of the administrative state, but because of greed, that is the goal. And it's not a desire to help blue-collar workers or the white working class. My God, isn't it clear? So they're yucking it up over that. The other person you got to watch out for is Pence. Pence created his own pact this week. Pence, by now, has probably figured out that he might be president soon, but he does not deserve to be president. As a matter of fact, he is up to his neck in all the prevarications because all of these warnings concerning Flynn that were given to the transition team would have or should have gone to Pence. He either knew or he should have known that this stuff was coming out about Flynn because Pence was the head of the transition team, and he's now in the White House. So Pence on the 9th of March claimed that he had no inkling of Flynn lobbying for the Turkish government. Oh, my God. So Pence, this wonderful persona, right, the farm boy, oh, shucks, oh, gosh, Robert Gates is somebody who occurs to me as somebody who has cultivated this kind of thing. So watch out for that. Now, let's take a look at the special prosecutor. Full disclosure, Robert S. Mueller III was in my class at Princeton. I don't remember him. Class of 1966. I don't think I've ever seen him. I don't know if I ever saw him then. Probably did, but I don't know. And certainly not in the interim. Robert S. Mueller III at the FBI, they called him Bobby Three Sticks because of the third, the Roman 3, after his name. St. Paul's School, a Pauli, top-level Eastern elite prep school, lacrosse team, Princeton, NYU, MA, joined the Marines, went to Vietnam, then University of Virginia Law School, worked for various law firms, Hill and Barlow in Boston, elite. Became head soon of the U.S. Criminal Division in Maine Justice. He had worked for William Weld in Boston, not good. Thornburg, Attorney General under Bush the Elder, not good. And of course, during these emerging years, he was important in the Pan Am 103 case, Lockerbie, Scotland. And you'll remember that this was blamed on Libya. And this looked like, to me, I haven't gone back to, re-research the entire thing, but it looked like a political targeting of Gaddafi. So there was something about Gaddafi that drove the imperialists crazy. So they wanted to target Libya, so they made it up that Pan Am 103 Lockerbie was Libya. The news that we had at the time, more likely to be certain cliques in the Syrian intelligence. And the Syrian intelligence in those days, that meant Hafez Assad, somebody who was being courted by the U.S., right? Courted for example, taking part in the first Gulf War. There were Syrian forces there. You'll remember Henry Kissinger once saying, God may punish me, but I have a soft spot in my heart for Hafez Assad. So it looks like there was a political decision made. Don't blame Syria, blame Libya. Mueller would have been involved in that. The other one was Noriega, Comandante Noriega, the head of Panama. Now, no angel, but some of the stuff he did was done more or less together with the U.S. intelligence community. Some of that drug running, because these were, of course, the years when Iran-Contra was occurring. And those people, right, operating out of the Reagan White House, were going wild, and Noriega might have been a part of that. But nevertheless, he had to take the fall. Then also the case of John Gotti. And this is interesting because there was one Teflon Don who didn't maintain his Teflon status, and that may rub off now on another Teflon Don that we have around. The most important, though, is, of course, becoming head of the FBI, a very troubled agency, in September 2001, about a week before the 9/11 attacks. And, of course, when all is said and done, we have to say, if we ask the question, did Mueller figure out what happened on 9/11, my personal answer would be no, not at all. There is a speech where Mueller says, it's surprising, we've been to Afghanistan now, we've conquered parts of Afghanistan, and we never found anything in Afghanistan, not a line on a computer, not any piece of evidence that would link anything in Afghanistan to the 9/11 attacks. In other words, all that stuff about bin Laden running it with a laptop from a cave, Ramzi bin al-Shib, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, all of that stuff, well, there never was much basis for it. So Mueller was content to administer that, I would say, colossal failure. And I guess what we get out of this is someone who follows an institutional consensus, let's say. And that might not be bad at this point, right? Now, of course, at this point, the reputation looms large. And I think the main thing is he's presented as impervious to popular opinion. Don't believe it for 1 second. As Abraham Lincoln said, popular sentiment is everything. And its popular sentiment is everything for anybody, including the special prosecutor. There is this one incident that's often cited when Comey stood up to Gonzalez and Andy Card, who were at the sickbed of Ashcroft, trying to get him to sign something illegal in terms of domestic surveillance. Comey said no, and Mueller, arriving later, the head of the FBI, also said no. So there might be some hope. But what I'm trying to say is, don't join in the media swoon. Not for Mueller, not for anybody. Last summer we had a media swoon for Manafort. Look how silly that looks in retrospect. So keep your critical glasses on. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So Trump is going now to Saudi Arabia. We're already told that there's a $110 billion arms deal with Saudi Arabia. Now, the Saudis have wanted that from the U.S., I think, for quite a while, and it was their human rights record that stood in the way. So this is going to be presented as a great favor done by Saudi Arabia to the U.S. But in reality, it's a favor by the current administration to Saudi Arabia, giving them something they've wanted and they didn't qualify for under, I think, applicable law. In Israel, if it's true that Israel was the source of the information on the exploding laptops or whatever it is, Blurtgate may become a problem there in Israel. In Rome, it will be meeting with Pope Francis. They disagree on everything, but Francis says he wants to find common ground. Let's see. Gentiloni, the Italian prime minister, who's already been to the White House, will be there too. Then the NATO summit in Brussels. The Washington Post of today is telling us that Europe is scared by the chaos in going on in the U.S., right? In the White House. Let's see if we can get that interesting quote. Europe alarmed about chaos in the U.S., says the Washington Post. Washington's closest allies in Europe are increasingly worried about rising political chaos in the United States that may be undermining the strength of the most powerful nation in the world. It is relevant. So somebody will have to be on best behavior. So that's going to be the NATO situation. Notice also there's an anti-nihilist backlash in Europe, in Germany especially. That is to say, Austria, Netherlands, France, nihilists defeated, and the nihilists in Germany are going nowhere. Right now, the bet would have to be Merkel stays in power. This cancels out all the nihilist plans from Bannon and similar people. And then on Taormina, Sicily. So here we are on the Cyclops coast, right? It's the eastern-facing coast of Sicily. This was the Greek area, right? Magna Graeca. Archimedes, the Greek, but lived in Syracuse, right? Syracusa, right there in Sicily. So this is Taormina. Beautiful, beautiful place. Been there. Ever get to go there, go there. It's in sight of Mount Etna, the biggest volcano in Central Europe. I think there's something in Spain that's maybe a little bit bigger, but this is the biggest. This is the G7. The Group of Seven is a series of summits of the principal Western economic powers that started at Rambouillet in 1975 under Schmidt and Giscard. It's U.S., Britain, France, Italy, Canada, Japan. Very often the European Union is there too. And there you go. So that's going to be the G7. But again, the question in Taormina is generally, like, the talk of the town is usually, is Mount Etna erupting? Because it's a very active volcano. I mean, I've seen that too. Plume of smoke coming out of it. Lava that you can see at night. So the question is usually, is Mount Etna erupting? The question now will be, is the American president erupting? Because it's a 9-day trip, 9 days on the road. No golf, not so many naps, might lead to psychological discontent along the way. So the other thing, of course, the editorial response, just to sample this for a second or two here. After the appointment of the special prosecutor, E.J. Dionne, sort of center-left Catholic opinion writer for the Washington Post, a quick end would be better. There is really only one issue in American politics at this moment. Will we accelerate our way to the end of the Trump story, or will our government remain mired in scandal, misdirection, and paralysis for many more months or even years? Michael V. Hayden, head of the NSA, head of the CIA, 4 stars from the Pentagon, a general, highly respected. Trump proves he's Russia's useful fool. The technical phrase coming from Lenin is usually translated as useful idiot. And that was yesterday. Today, Charles Krauthammer, voice of the neocons, the eminent neocon, Krauthammer says the guardrails can't contain Trump. And his argument is up until the last 10 days that we've just reviewed, things were looking, not good maybe, but more or less normal. Then came the past 10 days. The country is now caught in the internal maelstrom that is the mind of Donald Trump. We are in the realm of the id, the realm of the id. The impulses governing the United States are significantly generated by the id. Chaos reigns, no guardrails can hold. So that's the outlook. I think we've seen other predictions of a similar type. Now, we want to do a comparison here in our remaining time. Are there examples in the Western world recently, more or less in the past 50 or 100 years, of political leaders, heads of government, heads of state too, maybe kings, princes, who show this proclivity for excessive devotion to a foreign country, which may also be a rival and indeed an enemy? And what happens to them, and what did they do, especially in the area of state secrets? Now, this is an argument. This is, again, part of this argument about the evil insiders ganging up on the wonderful populist outsider anti-elitist hero, and is that nefarious? This is now a question of King Edward VIII. This takes us back to especially 1936 to 40 and these years, critical years. Now, King Edward VIII, the usual story is that he was forced to abdicate because he wanted to marry Wallace Warfield Simpson, this charming American woman, the woman he loved, but the mean Church of England wouldn't let him do it. The Archbishop of Canterbury and similar fuddy-duddies didn't like the idea that he was going to marry a woman who was divorced, not once, but twice, when it was taboo to be divorced. Now, this, of course, a cover story invented most likely by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin. This was, in effect, the court, people in Buckingham Palace, courtiers, plus the permanent civil service, plus the government, Stanley Baldwin and Sir Neville Chamberlain, right? A bunch of fuddy-duddies, if there ever was such a bunch. But here's the thing. King Edward VIII was pro-Hitler. He was a Nazi sympathizer. And we're going to hear what he did here if we have a couple of minutes left. I know that a lot of people are going to say, yeah, but those hidebound, stuffy, old, fuddy-duddy British politicians, how dare they get rid of this wonderful populist? He was such a populist. He was so popular with the people. He was young. He was a playboy. He dressed in the American fashion. He talked American slang. Wasn't this fascinating? He was a modernizer, some people would say. And he was popular. He had a base of support among the coal miners of Wales, and the steel workers of Wales in various steel mills that had been shut down. An outsider, a populist, a rebel, a playboy, and he was pro-Hitler. So you got to choose between pro-Hitler and the fuddy-duddies. And we'll tell you how it went in a minute here on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, our final segment. Do whatever you have to do to join us Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Go to americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv. Subscribe. It's worth it. And what I'm going to start now, I'm going to go into in more detail essentially the German attempt for world domination in the 30s and 40s worked through cartels and economic interests, among other things. And what I'm going to be developing this week on the American system, a Russian bid for world domination based on the oligarch international. In other words, oligarch to oligarch, ensnaring people in a web of economic interests and compromising them through this, but appealing to their greed. We'll be going into that. But let's go back now to King Edward VIII. Now remember, He went to see the Welsh coal miners when he was king, 1936. He was king essentially during the year of 1936. George V died in January. By December, this Edward VIII had been forced to abdicate by mean old Stanley Baldwin, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the London Times, Dawson, all of them, out. And the reason was they thought that he and also Mrs. Simpson were guilty of sympathies with the Nazi government. Mrs. Simpson reported to have had love affairs with Joachim von Ribbentrop, Nazi foreign minister, and Count Galeazzo Ciano, a little bit earlier, Italian fascist foreign minister. So he went to the coal mines, and it's a throwaway line. It's not a speech, and it's not a programmatic statement. He turns to his entourage and he says, you know, these people are all unemployed. Something must be done. And that was enough, right, for these poor beaten dogs in Wales in the 1930s to say, well, he must be on our side, right? He's going to help us. We're going to believe in him. Sound familiar? All right. So here's what he did, though. Let's look at his handling of top secret information. Here we go. In the mid-30s, we have a cocktail party. It's actually after 1936. It must be. I think it's in Vienna. We have the former king now, Edward VIII, forced out at the end of 1936. And he's talking with an American diplomat, a guy called Messersmith. And Messersmith, maybe sloshed, maybe trying to make himself look big, he says, oh, Your Royal Highness, you know, we Americans have we have great intelligence. We broke the Italian code, the fascist Italian code, and we found out that an ammunition train, an arms train going from Germany to Italy has crashed and blown up, and a lot of equipment has been destroyed. Now, this gave away the fact that the U.S. had cracked the Italian code. So what did Edward VIII, by now the Duke of Windsor, what did the Duke of Windsor do? The former Edward VIII, he immediately went to another party at the home of an Italian diplomat and said, hey, guess what? The Americans know your code, right? They broke it, right? So this was huge. And when Franklin D. found out about this, not so happy. Now, the second one is 1936, the first international move really by Hitler, and the thing that consolidated his power was the Rhineland, that is the area to the west of the Rhine, had been demilitarized under the Treaty of Versailles, the Peace of Paris. And Hitler wanted to remilitarize it, saying, what is this? They're going to tell us what we can do in our own country? So he sends in 3 to 4 battalions, not a lot, and not well armed. And many people say, look at that gamble. Look at that gamble. How could Hitler know? He did have a way of knowing. It was that Edward VIII, the Duke of Windsor, living by now in France, is in touch with a pro-Nazi industrialist by the name of Bedeaux, Bedaux. And this character is going back and forth from the Duke of Windsor to the German ambassador in The Hague, in Holland. And actually, I'm sorry, this is I've gotten the story a little bit mixed up. This is 1936, right? This is when Edward is on the throne. So Edward is king and Stanley Baldwin is prime minister. And the question is, if Hitler goes into the Rhineland, will the British do anything? Edward VIII telegraphs through various channels that he has to Hitler, we won't do anything. Go ahead and do it. I'm gonna make sure nothing happens. As a matter of fact, in a meeting between King Edward VIII and Stanley Baldwin, the prime minister, Edward says to him, look, Stanley, if you do anything to interfere with those Germans, I'm going to abdicate. I'm going to quit the throne, and then you'll have to explain why, because I'm so popular and the people love me and they don't love you. So the certainty, the likelihood that Hitler could do this and get away with it was in 1936. And thanks to the fact that you had this character as king, Edward VIII, that went down. Now, the other one, of course, is the military engagement of 1940, the fall of France. How was France defeated? There are many things that go into this story. the pro-fascist parts of the French officer corps, right? We know the work of Annie Lacroix, R-I-Z. But in particular, we know that the original plan by Hitler was to do a kind of repeat of the Schlieffen plan. In other words, to send a lot of the German army through Holland and Belgium, come down through northern France, and attack that way. It would have been a repeat of what they had planned for 1914, except that a German airplane with a courier bearing the entire war plan crashed in Belgium. The documents were partly burned, but partly captured by the Allies, right? By the British, the French, and the Belgians. And there was then a meeting of the Allied War Council saying, look, we have these plans now. We think we know what Hitler is going to do when he attacks. So we're going to redeploy along those lines. At a certain point, this is now this Bedeau, what I just mentioned, right? Bedeau, the pro-Nazi businessman, goes back and forth. The Duke of Windsor has now been made a major general in the British Army. So he gets a lot of intelligence. And, of course, he's a lounge lizard. He's in all the Parisian hotels. So he sends messages or talks to Bedeau, right? Maybe he doesn't even know what he's doing, but he does it nonetheless. Saying, oh, the Allied War Council has been meeting. They've apparently gotten a hold of the German war plan, which was found in an airplane that had crashed, and they're making dispositions to meet that, right? So they were getting ready to respond to the previous or the existing German plan. Hitler has had 50 or 60 divisions waiting because he doesn't know what to do. He gets this message through the Nazi ambassador in the Netherlands, and he sees everything. He says, look, I'm going to change the plan. Forget about the Schlieffen plan. We're going to go through the Ardennes forest. We're going to come to this point where Belgium and France and Germany come together. We're going to punch through there, just north of the Maginot Line, sort of in the center. Not the north, but the center. Not the Maginot Line. Not the south, but the center. We're going to go through the center, and this turns out to be the absolute optimum point for the attack, which then leads to the breakthrough. It cuts the whole Allied force in half. The British and the Belgians are trapped in the north. They have to flee through Dunkirk.